Hi there, and welcome to another Mr. Carter Science Special video. In this video we're going to be looking at your neurons and your reflexes. So let's start by reminding you, of course, as always, that you can keep your eye on the syllabus references to see where you are in your course. And we'll start by thinking about, so this is a reflex arc. You've seen it before in a previous video, but just to quickly summarize, this is an extremely fast process. It takes place in milliseconds. It's incredibly quick, and it allows your body to sense whenever there's a particular stimulus. Receptor cells in your body will sense that stimulus and they'll create an electrical nerve impulse. This electrical nerve impulse is sent along the sensory neuron. The nerve impulse crosses the gap known as the synapse, is then sent along the relay neuron, crosses another synapse, is sent along the motor neuron, and then eventually the electrical nerve impulse will get to the correct effector muscles and they will contract, and that brings about the response to the stimulus. And this response must be very, very fast to prevent any damage to your body. So that's what a reflex is. It's an incredibly fast system. But how is it so fast? Well, we're going to, in this video, look at these different neurons that are in this reflex arc and see how they're adapted to make certain that the electrical nerve impulse can travel extremely quickly around your body, creating very fast responses to stimulus. So first we're going to have a quick look at this keyword, neurotransmission. Transmission means to transmit or to carry or send, and neuro means sending messages along nerves or neurons. So nerves carry information in the form of an electrical nerve impulse, and neurotransmission is the travelling of an impulse through neurons. In this particular case here we have a sensory neuron. But all neurons are adapted to make certain that this electrical nerve impulse can travel quickly, and they're adapted by having long cell bodies and long extensions which are called dendrites or axon terminals, and they're incredibly long, very thin as well, and they help to carry the nerve impulse quickly around the body. All nerves are also, or all nerves in humans anyway, and animals, are covered in a fatty layer known as the myelin sheath. And you can see that here and here and here. This is actually just one particular cell that's wrapped around again and again and again and again. So it builds up layer after layer after layer of the cell membrane, and the cell membrane is basically made out of fat. And fat is an electrical insulator. So this fatty myelin sheath electrical insulates the nerve impulse so that it can't leak out, and that makes the nerve impulse travel much faster, so it speeds up neurotransmission. So if we have a look here, we've got two different types of neuron here. We've got firstly our sensory neuron here, and you can always tell it's a sensory neuron because the cell body is off to one side, and that cell body contains the nucleus there, that dark dot in the middle, which is our nucleus. But it's off to one side. It stays out of the way, so neurotransmission can be very quickly along here. And sensory neurons, they tend to have a very long dendron, and the dendron is before the cell body, and then after the cell body here we have a much shorter axon. And the sensory neuron will connect with, on one side, the receptor cell, and on the other side it's going to attach to the central nervous system. You can see that written down here, the central nervous system and the relay neurons. There will of course be a synapse between the two. Here we've got the classic diagram of a motor neuron. In this case we have a we don't really have a dendron, instead we have many little dendrites, which are thinner sections, shorter sections than a dendron, leading into the cell body, and then an incredibly long, thin, well-insulated axon, the axon being insulated with all of the myelin sheath. And the motor neuron will link with the central nervous system and the relay neurons, and at the other end it will link into the effector muscles, which will contract whenever an electrical nerve impulse reaches them. So here's a brief summary then of the three types of neuron in your body. We've got firstly sensory neurons, which carry impulses from a receptor cell to the central nervous system. Relay neurons, which are in the central nervous system, and they will carry impulses from sensory neurons to motor neurons. And finally, the motor neuron will send an electrical impulse from the relay neuron to a muscle cell. Now, the classic example of a neuron that you are likely to see in your exams is going to be one like this, and this is the motor neuron, the classic example. Here we've got some labeled diagrams of the relay neuron and the sensory neuron for you, just in case. So how would we label this? Well, firstly, you'd start by labeling the normal cell parts. So you have a nucleus there in the cell body. Inside that cell body, we would also have then cytoplasm. And then if I sort of draw it in, I'm not going to draw across the entire cell here, but what I will be drawing quite badly here, I'm afraid, is the cell membrane. We would also then at the end have our muscle strands or effector muscles. We would have the axon, the myelin sheath insulating the axon, and the dendrites, which I've sort of covered there. Let's get rid of that. The dendrites at the end, and the sensory neuron and the relay neuron would also have the same basic parts, but with a different structure, a different setup. So what about the synapses then? What about when two neurons come together? Well, they come together, but they don't actually touch. So if here we look at the end of one particular relay neuron reaching the cell body of a motor neuron here, well, what would happen if we look at that particular section? Well, if you can see carefully, they don't touch. They're really close together. I mean, they are millionths, thousandths of a millimeter apart, but they do not touch. So how is it that an electrical nerve impulse can cross this gap here? This is the gap between the relay neuron and the motor neuron. How is it that an electrical nerve impulse can cross this gap? Well, the gap's called a synapse. And if you notice, when the electrical nerve impulse is moving down here, it comes into contact with these little pockets here, and these are little vesicles that contain a special chemical called a neurotransmitter. And as soon as the electrical nerve impulses interact with these vesicles, the vesicles move forward and they fuse with the cell membrane and they release these neurotransmitters, these little triangle neurotransmitters, and they move across the synapse by simple diffusion. Because the gap is so small, this diffusion takes millionths of a second and is incredibly fast. When the neurotransmitters reach the other side, they begin to bond with receptors, protein receptors, that are embedded into the cell membrane of the motor neuron. And these receptors, when they receive the stimulus of the neurotransmitter chemical, they create new electrical nerve impulses which can then travel and carry on down the axon of the motor neuron going towards the effector muscles. So just pause the video now, think about what I've said, see whether or not you can fill in the gap fill. This could be worth 3 or 4 marks in an exam. Can you explain how electrical nerve impulse crosses the synapse? So here are the answers. Synapses are gaps between the different types of neuron. Chemicals called neurotransmitters carry the nerve impulse across the synapse, and synapses ensure that the nerve impulse travel in one direction only. The neurotransmitters will bond with receptor proteins on the cell membrane of the next neuron, and then enzymes will break down the neurotransmitters once the impulse has been passed on. So pause the video again, Have a think about these questions, and I'll give you the answers to these questions in a few moments. Think about how many marks you would gain in an exam question. Think about how much you have understood so far from a video. Perhaps you might need to go back, write some notes, copy down some of the slides that are in this video to help you answer these 6 questions. So let's have a look at some of the answers. What's the scientific name for a nerve cell? That would be a neuron. Explain how neurons are adapted to their function. Well, here we could talk about several different things. We could talk about the axons being long and thin so the nerve impulse can travel very quickly. We could talk about the myelin sheath being present to insulate the axons so that the nerve impulses can travel quickly. We could say that the axons are connected to effector muscle cells so that they can cause the muscle cells to contract. We could also mention that neurons have a number of dendrites so that they can connect to many different neurons so that we can get lots of different pathways and sense lots of different stimuluses within the body. Draw a diagram of these 3 cells. Well, I hope you tried this. Go back in the video and look at the diagrams we've already got. But in your diagrams, make certain you've labelled them. So we'd like to see the 3 basic parts of an animal cell labelled: the cell membrane, the nucleus, the cytoplasm. But we also need to label the dendrons and axon in a sensory neuron. We need to label the myelin sheath in the sensory neuron. A relay neuron only really has dendrons and very short axons, and a motor neuron will have only dendrites. It doesn't have a dendron beforehand, and it has a very long axon afterwards, again insulated by myelin sheath. So what about the extension questions then? So what's a synapse? Well, really simply, a synapse is a gap between 2 neurons. How does an electrical nerve impulse cross the synapse? Well, we should say that the electrical nerve impulse stimulates vesicles carrying neurotransmitters to fuse with the cell membrane to release the neurotransmitters into the synapse so that the neurotransmitters will diffuse across the synapse and bond with receptors in the next neuron, creating a new electrical nerve impulse. Now, the answer I've just given you there would be worth about 6 marks. But if it was only a 2-mark answer, I would talk about only the neurotransmitters being released into the synapse and carrying the electrical nerve impulse across the synapse to the next cell. So compare and contrast dendrons and axons. Well, dendrons are before the cell body and the nucleus. Axons are after. Typically in a sensory neuron, the dendrons will be longer and the axons will be shorter, but in a motor neuron, the axon will be much longer. They both carry electrical nerve impulses and they're both insulated by myelin sheath. So explain where dendrites are and what's their function. So dendrites are found in the motor neuron, and dendrites connect the motor neuron to many different relay neurons so that a motor neuron can be stimulated from lots of different relay neurons and lots of different receptor cells sending different messages from different parts of the body. Let's have a quick look at an exam question here. So pause the video, this is a 2-mark question, and just see whether you can answer the question. So let's have a look at the answer then. Look at the diagram of a reflex arc in the human body. What type of neurons are neurons? X here and Y here. Well, first thing that you need to do with any diagram like this is work out where is the stimulus. Remember, that's how we always start with a reflex arc, is looking for the stimulus. In this case, the stimulus will be the pin touching or stabbing into the skin of a person, and of course the stimulus will then link in with the receptors. Following on from the receptors, we then need to send an electrical message along the sensory neuron. So X must be a sensory neuron, spelled correctly, sorry. a sensory neuron. There's a couple of ways we know that, because it's linked to the receptor cells here, and also we can see that the cell body is off to one side. So that electrical nerve impulse will travel down the sensory neuron, across the synapse, through the relay neuron, and then to the final neuron, which is linked in with the muscles in your arm. So that third neuron, neuron Y, must be a motor neuron. Again, try these questions. I'll pause the video for a moment and then I'll give you the answers. So what's the advantage of a reflex arc when a finger touches a sharp pin? The advantage of a reflex arc is that it's always a fast response with no more damage to the body. Describe how the brain is linked to the finger in a reflex arc. Well, the brain is always connected to your spinal cord, and the spinal cord, full of those relay neurons, is connected to the finger by neurons. If you're being more technical, it would be the sensory neuron. I hope you've enjoyed this video on neurons and reflexes. Please don't forget to like and subscribe so you're receiving new videos as and when I create them. And I hope that this is helping you in your learning and your preparation for your GCSE exams. Thank you very much. This has been a Mr. Carter Science Special video.